Hey guys, how's it going? I'm the Duke of Italy, your favorite lo-fi music YouTuber, and today I am in pain because I bit my lip really hard earlier. I took my girl out to some Italian food, and I just was talking and eating at the same time, having some prosciutto, and I just bit my lip. And also, I'm not recording with a beer, which would soothe my ailment. So this is going to be a fun one because it's also going to be a long video today. This is a very long video we're doing today because I'm going to be reviewing like 30 albums, a truly insane amount of albums, a lot of albums and various other projects, because this is another part of the drone rock and metal series. And on this part in particular, we will be covering the drone rock portion. Last time we covered sort of the introduction section, which was admittedly mostly metal, more stuff on the harsher side, stuff on the, I guess, less accessible to like a normie, but like easier if you were like actively listening. Good active listening experiences with a lot of harsh overtones, very harsh, clear portions such as harsh vocals, screaming, distorted guitars, the like, really, just that, a lot of that stuff. And you had a lot of good stuff. That was probably the best collection of music that this thing would have. Today we are covering the whole left portion of this chart. We just covered the middle. Now we're going off to the left, which I'll show the whole thing on the final part if I remember. Please, I really hope that I do remember. But today we'll be covering the sort of giant rock section. And I would love to yap further and keep explaining my situation, but I think I could just dive right on into the music. First thing we do is we take all that middle stuff, and then it says to add stoner rock. And here we are with something pretty influential just to kick it off. Ohm with Adviatic Songs. Starting off the top of our section, on the very top left portion, we have Ohm, a band that is formed from the members of Sleep. The only one missing is Matt Pike, general riff master himself. Instead, we have the other two members. You get a very different experience from the band Sleep. Sleep, for those of you who don't know, is a stoner doom band from the late 90s through the 2000s. They even dropped an album less than a decade ago that was actually an amazing drone metal. They actually dropped an album less than a decade ago that was an amazing stoner doom album, and all of their albums even sound a bit different. It's really just their first album is kind of, no one really talks about it all that much, but they were known for having an hour-long song album being Dope Smoker, so naturally, at least a couple of these members would show up somewhere on this chart, and here we are with Adviatic Songs, which has deep religious overtones as well as undertones. It's kind of like the theme of the band. It does lack that thick layer of distortion that Sleep typically has, but it's very cool in its sort of spiritual explorations. Both the guitar and various other string melodies are just sick. You get a very meditative experience with this whole thing. It has this very slow, very ritualistic pace to the whole thing, as well as plenty of breathing room for every single one of the instruments to get their own little spotlight. And the really melodic bass work from Al, vocalist of the band, provides some really excellent momentum to the whole thing, as well as just another really interesting set of melody. He just sort of carves his way through the entire album, really taking his place as the frontman. And the strings over the whole thing are just gorgeous. It adds a lot of layers to this where there weren't before. I love this album. I think it's great. I had a fantastic time listening to it, as well as a very cathartic one. It was very pleasant to listen to. But why stop there with bands we talk about a lot already? Because next we're moving on to Earth, which this is one of the last times we'll be mentioning them on this chart. They have one more time, but unfortunately their other drone metal stuff will not be showing up on this chart. But here we have Pentastar. Yes, a very stoner rock sort of related album. Earth has been known for their single riff songs repeating for forever, and Earth 2, of course, is its most proper iteration, but here on Pentastar, it's sort of like an homage to stoner rock and stoner doom. Never quite reaching Sleep levels of like deep stoner doom level metal, but you have these bluesy riffs that can loop for as long as they feel like, as well as some really interesting sort of very vast meditative passages and songs that can repeat the entire time. It's certainly minimalist and takes its time overall, but it also can be pretty groovy at points. It's like ritualistic rock music. It's also very engaging. I would deem it as good driving music. Kind of interesting that the album cover is almost representing that. It's a hypnotic album overall, but it has the whole weight and power of rock music to give it a lot of body. I think this album is great. I think it does a very good, I think it's a very good experiment in taking sort of post rock and making it more back into rock music. It's really taking rock music and saying, how much can the intent of rock music be stretched? Like, how much can you do with that? And up next, we're covering something that nobody knows, a band called Gnod, G-N-O-D, with Science and Industry, which you can find on Bandcamp. It's 2 half-hour long psych jams, and they are just these rolling, noisy behemoths. And since the songs are so long, they have just so many passages and so many movements. One of my favorite parts of the whole album is sort of part 2, or like sort of the closing portion of the first song, which has this really intense rolling drum pattern that really amplifies the energy. The drumming is very repetitive, but it's also very intense. It reminds me a lot of Swans, especially later period Swans. But the progressions of these songs work very well. They sort of have an A to B structure to them that just escalates, and then everything shifts into gear, and it just turns really quite explosive. As standard as description may be, how deep and heavy and explosive the whole thing was really appealing to me personally. So I find it to be great. It's a great post-rock example. The drones are also really hazy and really awesome. And up next we have a band called Bong with an album called, let me make sure I get this, Mana Yud Sushai? Yeah, doesn't really matter, but it is not metal, but it is super doomy in a weird way. It sounds huge, but it like distinctly doesn't feel like metal. It definitely pulls away from all that stuff and dives into the droney parts. It goes into the spiritual aspects. Dare I say ambient? I enjoy the first track a bit, but I think the second track does have a better application of atmosphere, which kind of makes the album feel a bit lopsided. Unfortunately, it's not always interesting overall. It's a pretty unmoving drone. It's sort of just like the same rhythm section over and over again, which just kind of lacks anything too interesting. I do find this album to be okay. There are certainly some decent writing portions, and not every riff is bad. It's all right, actually, but there's just not enough here for me to really sink my teeth into. But up next is a band called Horseback with an album called Half-Blood. Here you get a really simple psychedelic album with these really cool groove riffs that sort of propel the entire thing. And my favorite addition to this whole thing is the really drony organ section, which provides some excellent explorations of timbre and tone. Sonically, this thing is really something to chew on. The 3-part conclusion of the album is actually really cool. It's actually the droniest part of the album, and it's just got you drooling. To me, it is an album that is good, I have to say. It is frequently on the brink of greatness. Everything here is solid. I just want a tiny bit more out of each part. I do think the conclusion is really excellent. It's just I kind of wish that was the quality everywhere else. And next to the stoner section of this chart, it adds a jam band and psych influence. And here we are with Scattered Purgatory with Burial Chamber Sessions. So this is certainly an interesting band. They're from Taiwan, which is quite cool. I wouldn't really describe them as jam band because they lack drumming for like almost its entirety, but psych rock is definitely here. It is a massive album, which is this really heavy psychedelic drone rock full of electronics. This thing is just straight no chaser, just a harrowing, maybe not harrowing is the right word, but it stares you down. It's kind of a scary album just to look at conceptually, but then you actually digest it and it's a pretty worthwhile experience. It sounds sick. It is one of the haziest, droniest albums here. I would say it is slightly more accessible than Earth, specifically Earth 2, but it's just as expansive. This thing lasts like an hour in length. It feels really hazy. It makes you feel like you're walking on desert sands for a lot of it, which I think is really cool. The psych stuff is really, really excellent. I think this album's great. The experience of it is truly unique. And it's definitely a band I'll have to check out a little bit more in the future. And next we have my poor handwriting coming to strike me down again, a band called Sleestack with Altrusian, something like that. Which is an interesting album because it sounds like a live recording. It's this really dope sort of stonery space rock, and it's covered with all these like glacial, slow, one-note melodies, which actually feel rather excellent. It is very doomy, but it never gets earth-shatteringly loud, and this sort of stagnancy is actually rather appealing. The meditative qualities are really accompanied well by the nice production. You know, everything fits. It's blended very well. I'd say this is really good music to wait to because the time is just gonna pass you by. It's cool stuff. It's these raw but fun jam sessions with a whole ton of wah pedal. I would describe it as good. I do wish the tones were just a little bit more appealing, maybe just a little bit of dynamics in there, but overall this was not a bad experience. Then we have a project called Parsons Sound with their self-titled archival release. This is a band from the 70s, which before forming other bands, they decided to compile a 2-hour long discography into one tape, which for being from the 70s, this thing is crazy, and I honestly wasn't loving it. It's super drony, super abstract, super long. It is just the most druggy, minimal jams. This is true hippie stuff. I think the track India Slight Return is great, but it is a bit of an exception. So many of these tracks don't have any benefit from their overly raw production. I'd say the cleaner sounding tracks are rather beautiful, but the jams, in my opinion, just sound bad. It's certainly interesting, but I think sonically we have so many bands that just do it better. I am going to listen to everyone and what they all say about this project and re-listen to it, but right now I just think it's okay. I just wish I spent my time elsewhere. And then we're going into a bit of a folk/country influence section with a band called Barn Owl with an album called The Conjurer. So you get this cool sort of cowboy themed drone music. There's not a ton that happens, clearly, but it's cool. It is certainly a drone album, there's no doubt about it. Not even a lot happens that much. My notes are pretty minimalist. I was like scrambling to find stuff to write about. But that being said, sonically, it's appealing. It's kind of backgroundy in terms of playing, but it keeps you locked in. It seems like something that would be better used as like an accompaniment to something. There is a whole array of different instruments that I don't know how to name, but you hear them in Western themed things all the time. As droney and minimalist as this whole thing is, and it is extremely that, it passes by super quickly. This thing's gonna feel like it's only 10 minutes long, which the imagery and the atmosphere is what's key here. It has a lot of American Ideal imagery that feels really, really interesting. There were a couple of shoegaze albums I reviewed this summer that has sort of a similar vibe to this whole thing, but I think this thing actually does it better. For now, I'm just going to say it's good. I will have to re-listen at some point, but I think it is worth your time. It is a very interesting atmosphere, and I have no problem with it. Up next is Headdress with Lanes, which we start with a 6-minute straight drone track that just goes into the psychedelic build, which this album is basically one giant track that is psychedelic, very minimalist, no drumming. It has really cool textures overall. I think it's very relaxing. It is mostly looping guitar with very slow building on top. Minimal for sure, but the tones of it sound great. The last track adds all the distortion and all the cool stuff, which is awesome. So I think this album is good. I just wish all the cool stuff was elsewhere. Maybe that's my own subjective gripe. Maybe it's a personal thing. Maybe other people would like it more. But I just think the drones really felt like they were leading to something, and it took too long to get somewhere. It's just the other sections don't feel as gratifying, especially that opening drone track. And up next we have the last time we'll be mentioning this band, Earth. The Bees Made Honey in the Lion's Skull, a classic psychedelic sort of folky album here, and a different one for everybody involved here. This is very repetitive, mantric American rock. I feel so weird about this album because every song in here feels very similar to the other ones, but they all have this level of grandiosity. It feels like they're all painting a different picture. The production is great. This thing sounds as full as possible, and the guitar solos are somewhat minimalist, but they sound just soaring. The sheer array of instrumentation makes this thing just so dense. It's a really remarkable amount of density. So if you want a good drone album, The Bees Made Honey in the Lion's Skull is a great drone album. It has just enough songwriting to be really interesting. I wouldn't go in here expecting like fantastic progressions, but just for what it is, it sounds fantastic. And up next is a band called Aseeth with an album titled Red Horizon, which is a monolithic, buzzing, 9-minute long doom metal song. It is supremely mantric. The lead guitar is a real highlight, but it is very simple. It never breaks too out of what this album or song knows to do with itself. It's very meditative. It's excellent stuff. It's great. And if you just have 9 minutes, you could listen to it too and make it feel like somewhere between 2 minutes and a lifetime. And up next we have a band called Boredoms with an album called Sea Drum, a sort of influential Japanese project here known for blending sort of some progressive elements into their stuff. But this one is really different. It's a 2-song album. Both are these giant progressive suites filled with these really thick and hazy sort of Sun Ra-esque avant-garde jazz bricks. And the first song is amazing. I've heard it described as like the birth of the universe. It is one of the most vibrant and colorful tracks I have ever heard. The song Sea Drum is like this giant krautrock piece that is just swelling and whirling and has tons of energy, but it feels overwhelmingly positive. It's so lifelike. The song House of Sun is more of a brick. It just has sheer amount of density and energy. It just can't be stopped, but it is also really hazy as well. I could just keep going on about this album, but it's great. Go listen to it yourself. You will be happy that you did. And up next, we have a band called Master Musicians of Bukkake with Totem 3. Just from the title alone, part of me wishes I could say this thing is horrible, and another part of me wishes to say it was great. Unfortunately, it's neither. It's folky, it's progressive, it's got some really weird influences behind this whole thing. It feels a bit like Exotica. It's got that Parsons Sounds Indian obsessive qualities, which doesn't really do anything for me. It's like if you combine elements of post-rock with funk music, and texturally this thing is really cool. You reach the third movement of this album, and you have a serious amount of weight with the guitars, which sounds really interesting. The dynamics here are surprisingly good for a drone album. The folk influences and the more like heavy, sort of like funk adjacent, sort of bassy parts of this whole thing are really interesting. It feels like something out of the 70s, but they made it in the 2000s, and it's a little bit satirical, and I think it's good. Part of me just doesn't know what to make of it, and also part of me just thinks, why would someone make this? What sounds appealing about it? But I had fun. And up next is S&M with Shaman. I am disqualifying this thing. I couldn't find it anywhere. I couldn't find a download. I couldn't find a Bandcamp link. I couldn't even find a Rate Your Music link. This thing is, I can't find it. So I don't know why someone said it's part of an essential thing on a chart, like Lysol by Melvins wasn't hard to find as well, oddly enough. But that you could download that from any website you can download things from. So skip this one. Or just one of you can tell me how it is. Or if you're part of the band, you can upload it and have it so I can hear it. Up next, we have Bull of Heaven with number 101. Bull of Heaven is known for having an album that's in like the quintillion years long range, as well as a bunch of albums that are worth hundreds of years long. They have one album that's 6 years long, and you could listen to, 20 hours of it. I do not know why these men are the way that they are, but Bull of Heaven is interesting because they actually have some things worth listening to. This is one of them. If you think there's an album that is quintillions of years long, it's probably going to be somewhat drony, and it is. It's the same like micro sound texture bumping for what I can assume is 6 million years long, or however long it is. They made so many zip files and so many repeated parts. There's research these guys. They're kind of fun. But they actually spent some effort to make some decent quality music, this being one of them. They do have a few sort of psych rock, progressive rock, drone albums that have some appeal to them. They have albums ranging between like under 30 minutes to like a few hours in length, and those are a lot more accessible, obviously, than their other stuff, which I think even a few years into their career, they started making albums that were like in years long length, but they don't have that many. They just have like a few albums that are like 20 hours long. But here you get this really chill guitar sound over a lot of droning, which repeats for about an hour and 20 minutes. And that sounds horrible, but it's not. It is really one to sink into. It's like a spiritual ear massage, and I mean it. These textures are perfectly tuned. It is almost completely stagnant. It barely grows, if at all, but it is also very beautiful. It does suffer from the same problem that most drone albums out there suffer from, where you can't just dive in and you have to absolutely blast it. This thing has to be loud, and that's not all that practical, but I would recommend it anyways. I think this one's good. I don't think it's for everybody. I don't think you're gonna like bring your girl in your car and be like, you want to hear some music, and then play Bull of Heaven's number 101. I wouldn't recommend playing any Bull of Heaven for your lady out there, except for a couple of the projects. There are a couple that are okay, but that's like 1%. And if you're talking about like musical length, then it's like not even a fraction of a percent, because everything in their discography equals like not even 1% of that one other album. But that's enough being tedious today, and let's talk about more drone. We actually finished that section. We're going on the other side of this side with a progressive and noise rock feature with some prog, except like not really. I don't know why that's claimed to be here, but Forget all that noise. We're going into Boris with Feedbacker, which is a 5-part, 1-song monolith. It's the slowest psych jam ever that is so loud it feels like it's falling apart. The feedback and the textures are insanely huge. And I mentioned Flood earlier on this chart, and these two albums are a bit comparable to each other, but Feedbacker is less on the meditative side, less on the beautiful side, a lot more on the rock side. It dives in further and heavier. The guitar portions are just screeching, and especially when you reach part 4 of this album, it is a straight noise track. It is insanely loud. Go experience it for yourself. If this thing is great, it might be the coolest album on the entire chart. I have said too much about it because you should go experience it for yourself. And then I mentioned we'd stop talking about this band, but it's just one guy here. Dr. Carlson Albion, which is one word, with Edward Kelly's Blues, which is Dylan Carlson from Earth, which these are 2 slightly over 20-minute long drone songs that you have to stitch together on different YouTube videos because we can't have nice things anymore. It's not at all noise rock. It's just guitar droning, which sounds awesome, but doesn't really give me enough to like. And the whole thing feels nice, but the B-side, man, does the B-side drag. It's just more of the same that I don't really need to care for. So this thing's okay. It's just there's like very little substance here. It feels like a very random thing. It feels like something you'd find on Bandcamp randomly. And up next we have a band called Alec Totolo with an album called Fisternus, which is really 5 songs, but on Spotify it's only 1 song, and it's 35 minutes long, which is this really cool feedback-based sort of minimalist krautrock. And after about 23 minutes of feedback droning, 23 minutes in, it metamorphosizes into just a beast. I would wager there are only 2 drum patterns this entire album, but they are both all that's needed. It's super, super noisy. I would wager that it even peaks at various moments, but it's a super cool experience. It's one of the most maximalist krautrock albums I've ever heard in terms of just sonic weight. You know, like not a lot of changing over time. It's just, it doesn't need to. It's this thing is really cool. It's great. It's super noisy. It's edgy. It's awesome. And I bet you weren't expecting these dudes on this side of the chart. Sun. They're back with Scott Walker with an album called Soused. It's Soused. Which this one's really cool because you get Sun basically accompanying Scott Walker for a really awesome album where he just screams about the most uncomfortable things ever. And by screaming, I mean he's singing about it with his weird sort of baritone, old school Baroque pop style vocals. It's actually following Monoliths and Dimensions by a few years, and the textures of the guitar are very similar. It's very cool, a really cool way to add some sonic weight. It's disturbing, apocalyptic, even a bit downright doom metal at points, which Sun riffing really isn't a thing you hear much, but it's really awesome. You have really dark lyrics, and the sparse drone metal textures add a lot here. I would dare say this album is underrated because it's great, and no one seems to talk about it. They all seem to be disappointed with it, and I don't get it. I think the atmosphere is awesome, but it might just be because I don't know a lot of Scott Walker. Maybe people are disappointed in comparison to other Scott Walker albums, but this one is so cool. It sounds so alien, so uncomfortable, just bizarre. Cool stuff. Up next is the Infinite 3 with Medium Term Strategy, which has an EP on Bandcamp. That's where you find this, which is a 25-minute long record store day release, which is some droney stuff, which has a lot of repetition, reminding me a lot of krautrock. And what's really cool is the sheer amount of guitar noise here, which is the main feature. But it's so alien and so weird, it feels less like rock music and more like turntablism, plunderphonics, noise, a lot of really weird influences here that make the guitar, I think it's mostly just like pedal usage. It's a really cool vibe. This is basically just a example of the band's earliest material. It's like a demo that they just repackaged, but I think it's really cool. I would say it's good. I wish there was a bit more weight to the whole thing, maybe a bit of actual mixing going on here, because it feels like a demo, but it's still really cool. And up next is a band called Mono with Ghouls, which is, I would dare say, a standard affair of drone metal with a doom metal sense of drumming. And while the guitars don't riff much, the drums act like they do. It keeps on crashing away with some really heavy mixing on the cymbals. It's very repetitive and basically ambient at this point, but it's honestly really cool. The guitars sound completely bizarre and faded, which the whole thing sounds like a cloud. Like the metal stops being metal when everything just turns into just wisps. And this is the type of music that happens for most of the album. It is a working formula. It just drones and drones and drones, and it knows what it's doing. Part of me wishes there was a bit more going on here, but I would just say that it's good as is. I do kind of wish for a little bit more in some direction or another, but as a drone experience, it's perfectly fine. It very much paints the band into a corner very early on. And up next is a really cool album, Rhys Chapman with Crimson Grail for 400 guitars, which apparently this is one composition, which on Spotify they claim this was for 200 guitars, which is played in this giant room, and this is a very underrated album already. A lot of people claim this thing to not be as powerful as it is in person, which I don't even know this man. I now want to know this man because he made one of the most interesting and cool guitar compositions I've ever heard for sure, and it's for a lot of guitars all put around the room, all arpeggiating and playing these really simple melodies that build and build and build to something that sounds so insanely huge that you can't really ignore it. It has a very post-minimalist type of feel to the whole thing. It reminds me a lot of, say, what's his name? I don't know, the guy that did the soundtrack for Mishima and Truman Show, whose name is just eluding me. But this album has a single drummer and 400 guitars that play like an orchestra, and it's easily one of the best textural experiences you will ever get to hear. It has 3 parts that are all just a tiny bit different from the other ones. Part 1 is a suite in its own, reaching about 35 minutes in length. But part 3 is super, super cool. It's just this crazy repeating melody that is deeply engaging and even motivating. This thing is repetitive but beautiful in every single way. This thing is great. One of my favorite albums on this whole chart. Deeply underrated. I'm going to have to follow this man just everywhere now and see what he's up to. And up next is a band called Magnog with More Weather. It's a 2.5 hour long album of meandering psych jams. It's okay. This band will waste your time. I will not. And up next is Godspeed You Black Emperor with Sweet and whatever the heck this thing's called. Asunder, Sweet, and Other Distress. I wish I actually cared about the title because I really care about the music. And it doesn't feel like a drone album from the first get-go, but there are 4 movements here, the second and third of which are all drones and feedback. And this is a surprising Godspeed release because there's no samples of anyone speaking. It doesn't feel as political. It is simply a swarming, huge ascension of music. And I think an underrated Godspeed You Black Emperor release. And I'm going to say it. It is better than Slow Riot for Zero Canada. That's a good EP, but like, come on. Is it that good? I say this like I'm not going to see Godspeed You Black Emperor in November, but I hope they played this one because it is sick. Yeah, I love this album. It's only 35 minutes in length, but it leads into this final triumph. Everything about this thing is awesome. It's great. I find it to be one of those like glowing, like bright, just hot, just energetic albums that you don't get a lot of anymore. Up next is a band called 26 with This Skin Is Rust, an album that I have previously not heard of, single pressing on vinyl, of a band that I would say combines elements of slowcore, being post-hardcore like Slint, that one, what's that one band that's like ended up forming Battles. I'm trying to think. They have like the CD cover. I don't know. I think it's like a really long title, so I won't even bring it up. But like, this is a super, super cool, very minimalist, very meditative, mostly guitar based, mostly single riffs per song, cloudy, rainy atmosphere of a thing. It kind of reminds me of Boris and Merzbau's Monodrone, Megatone. That's what it's called. It has that same sort of like blanketing atmosphere to the whole thing that feels utterly excellent. It's a really, really cool album that I think you guys should experience for yourself, but I have a couple more things to say. It is bleak and it is quiet, and for being both of these things, it has a lot to say. For how repetitive this is, you would expect the tone to stop being so clean, but the sort of raw production actually gives this thing a huge, huge boost. I think this thing is great. The atmosphere is utterly unparalleled. And just in case things weren't annoying enough, we have a band called Zigin with Word Wounder, or whatever the heck it's called. I'll put the image up here. Maybe I'll even spell it, which I have no faith in myself, but I wish I did because this album's actually really cool. Mostly guitar crafted loops that are pushed a bit forward with some organ textures. Already, to me, this sounds like the best album of all time. It is rich and beautiful while also being intensely noisy. The opening track, Breathe In, is just a triumph. It seems to be so drony, but then you get this sort of turntablisms causing this huge amount of like glitch music, actually. It's really, really energetic. It feels exciting, explosive in a way that is just unparalleled. It's got such a disjointed rhythm to the whole thing. It's incredibly harsh, something that you need to experience for yourself. It's very moving overall, such an interesting album. The last track actually reminds me of something off of The Seer, so I think it's great. Gotta mention that. Speaking of The Seer, what should I even say about this thing that hasn't been said before? Not just because I'm going to review it next year in my full Swans discography review once I continue that thing again, but this thing is extremely dark, very folky, very heavy. The Apostate is a banger. The Seer makes me want to curl up into a ball, and Lunacy sounds perfect, and this album is amazing. It's great. I have it on vinyl, and I spent all the money for it because one, I'm really cool and awesome, and two, I am make poor financial decisions. Up next, we're back with Sun and Ulver with Terrestrials. Rest in peace, Ulver. The guy from Ulver just died. He was in the band for like 20 years, and it was actually the first time I heard an Ulver album that wasn't Flowers of Evil or the first three albums. So I've heard one of the later synth pop albums and the early black metal stuff, but I've never heard the more experimental ambient drone stuff. And this album is a little bizarre. It feels like an album where both bands know exactly who they are, and they think, oh, we can just do whatever we want at any point, and it doesn't have to fit as an album. It feels a lot like these bands made a bunch of songs and put them on an album instead of releasing them as singles when they kind of should have been. They're just all a little bit too different from each other. That is my only complaint. I think this album is really underrated. I actually found it insanely enjoyable. And the reason I kind of had that complaint was because Ulver has vocals on the ending, which it's their typical synth pop style art pop vocals that don't really fit with the avant-garde leanings of Sun, which, by the way, this is the softest Sun has ever sounded, including White 2. It's like layered and beautiful and interesting. It's really something to sink into. You just want to go through every crevice of this thing and just scoop it out. It does have Ulver's classic dark atmosphere that is not strayed from even a little bit. And it's a shockingly concise album, being only 35 minutes and 3 songs in length, which for either of these projects is pretty short. As much as it's not my favorite from either band, it is just awesome. Oddly enough, I don't even think it feels entirely complete, but I think this thing is great. It makes me wish there was a 4th song, but it doesn't entirely need it. It's a very good listening experience overall. And up next we have live at Rock the Garden, Low, with their hit song, Do You Know How to Waltz, which is a really interesting song. It starts off with this sort of guitar murmuring, a actual slowcore song in there, and then droning of like tremolo 4 chords for as long as they feel like. The original version is about 13 minutes long, pretty long, and it comes out of nowhere on Curtain Hits the Cast, which is a great Low album, really dreary one, pretty cool as well. All of Low albums are at least okay, but this one is really good, and this song is probably the best song there, and it sounds insane. And of course they do it live, and it sounds just as insane. It is them droning these same 4 chords with these weird tremolo effects, not even effects, just like finger plucking the same string for a super long time. It feels so lush and so warm, but also extremely, extremely interesting, extremely harrowing as well. Low was never one to shy away from harsh topics. And rest in peace, Mimi Parker, because this song is great, and I love it. One thing I should mention, since this is here, there's also a live version of Do You Know How to Waltz that is almost as long, that involves the entirety of Godspeed You Black Emperor. So I haven't listened to it, actually. I hate to say, but I think it's worth listening to. Everyone I know says it's good. A little lo-fi, but I'm going to check it out at some point. It sounds cool. And finally, we have Ensemble Pearl, which is a collab of the Sun members and Atsuo from Boris. Yeah, a weird thing for sure. Not insanely heavy, but really cool drone rock compositions. It does like a little bit of entertainment value. I think it does have a wide variety of emotion, which is the coolest thing here. The song Ray, spelled W-R-A-Y, is very emotional and actually rather beautiful. And the track Sexy Angle, it actually has this like dark jazz, twisted atmosphere to the whole thing, which feels like the band Club de Gore with their more minimalist stuff. I just think this album's lacking a bit in action, so it's good. And finally, that's all the albums I'm going to talk about today. Except there's one more thing to talk about. Drone Not Drones. Drone Not Drones is a anti-war festival that happens every year. I don't know where, but it happens, where a bunch of drone artists get together and play one giant set, one after the other. And it's for 24 hours straight. So, of course, I didn't listen to that. I didn't listen to any 24-hour long set. But before the set happened, they didn't exist a different set, which happened entirely because of a certain giant health problem that the entire world had to stay in a house for like a year and a half, maybe longer. It's hard to remember. But, during that time, they decided, hey, Drone Not Drones should still continue, so let's do a 1 hour long set. Guess what I listened to? A 1 hour long set of Drone Not Drones. Probably like 5 artists who drone together. And here's the thing. Not very rock, not very metal, not very guitar-y, but I'm sure the other projects of theirs were. This was all solo artists doing a giant sort of drone ambient set. And it was cool. You couldn't even notice them switching between each other, which was very interesting. You could notice some various changes here and there, which I liked, but I don't think it was amazing. But it's cool. There's a lot of variety from everyone involved, and they all add different textures. They add a very unique experience to the whole thing. It makes this whole thing feel like one giant song with different movements rather than a bunch of different sets that just so happen to piggyback off the other. It's way more variety than you'd expect. It's very entertaining and very comfy. I'd have to say this is worth watching, and if you're really, really, really into drone, and I'm not a completionist myself, so you guys could do this, do whatever the heck you want, you might want to check out the 24-hour long ones, or even go to one of the festivals, which, if it was somewhat local to me, I'd go at some point. Maybe. I don't even know. But that is all I will be talking about today. Finally, thank God. Let me just switch my notebook around because oh boy, that was a lot. We're approaching about an hour of recording time, but that's all for today. And quick little announcement, very sorry. I am about to go on a little trip for about a week, and I'll be back real soon, but I won't upload between at least the 23rd and the 1st. So if you're looking for a video then, you won't get one. Sorry. I doubt you've seen all my videos. Go back and watch, I don't know, the Blade discography review. That one's pretty sick. But yeah, I got plenty of stuff for you guys to watch, and I will be back with the final part of this, and then my October content, which I am so excited for, as well as a live concert review, which I'm very excited for as well. I will be seeing Boris October 23rd with a amplifier worship set, which would be a good way to sort of add to the end of the year of my Boris and Merzbow collaborative discography review, as well as the drone rock and metal music. I think Boris fits perfectly with those. I think it's a good way to sort of end the year of drone rock and metal, as that's kind of what I'm doing for the end of the summer going into the fall. But I've been talking for way too long. Jen made this thumbnail. Please go follow Jennifer on Instagram. I would appreciate it. And commission them for some art, because they should have some money. They should have some more money from your pocket. And so should I, but I have nothing for you to give it for. So just kind of follow my social medias, like and subscribe here. I'd appreciate it. Or if you have any comments, questions, or concerns, go ahead and put those down there below this screen to where there's a comment box. You should be able to click it and then type on your keyboard. If it's not working, you might want to disable shift sticky keys, press shift a few times, or just like restart your computer if you have to. But yeah, my social media is also in the description along with Jen's. You'll find my Instagram, my X, and my Discord page where we talk about Blade a lot. And that is that's it. So I hope you guys have a good day. Bye.